I was sitting in my office when my phone buzzed with a number I hadn't seen in almost 3 years. Bennett Development Group. For a few seconds, I just stared at the screen. This was the same company that had escorted me out with a cardboard box, the same company that had decided 10 years of loyalty could be erased in a single meeting, and the same people who never once asked for my side of the story. The phone rang until it stopped, then rang again. I ignored both calls. Instead, I leaned back in my chair and looked through the glass wall of my office. Outside, people moved through the building without tension. Managers laughed with engineers, and young project coordinators stopped by one another's desks to solve problems instead of protecting territory. It wasn't a perfect company, but it was the kind of place I had always wanted to help build. My assistant knocked lightly before opening the door. "Andrew, everything okay?" she asked. I smiled. I think someone from my past finally ran out of people to blame. She nodded without asking another question and quietly closed the door. A minute later, a voicemail notification appeared. It was Richard Bennett. His voice sounded older than I remembered. "Andrew, if you can, please call me back. We need your help." Need. That wasn't a word anyone at Bennett Development had used when they forced me out. For years, I had imagined what I would say if they ever contacted me again. In reality, I said nothing. Because to understand why I never answered that first call, you have to understand what Bennett Development once meant to me. It wasn't just a company. It was the place where I believed I would spend the rest of my career. 10 years earlier, if someone had asked me to describe my job, I probably would have undersold it. I wasn't the CEO, and I wasn't even one of the executives people saw in magazines or at industry conferences. I was a senior project director. My work happened behind conference room doors, construction fences, and client meetings that never made headlines. But inside Bennett Development, everyone knew where to find me when something started going wrong. If a project fell behind schedule, someone called me. If a client threatened to walk away, someone asked me to join the meeting. If two departments couldn't agree on a solution, I usually ended up in the middle of the conversation. That wasn't because I was the smartest person in the company. It was because I listened before I spoke. Over time, people started trusting that if I said something needed attention, it probably did. I liked it that way. Recognition was nice, but reliability lasted longer. Richard Bennett understood that. He had founded Bennett Development decades earlier, building it from a small local contractor into one of the region's most respected real estate developers. Richard wasn't the kind of owner who hovered over everyone. He hired good people, expected them to do their jobs, and stepped in only when something truly mattered. Whenever a difficult project landed on my desk, he would usually stop by afterward. "Handled?" he'd ask. I'd nod. He'd nod back. That was often the entire conversation. Looking back, those brief exchanges meant more to me than any formal performance review ever could. One afternoon, we were preparing for a meeting with one of our oldest clients, Helen Carter. The project had run into several unexpected delays caused by supply shortages, and everyone expected an uncomfortable discussion. Instead of promising impossible deadlines, I laid out every issue honestly and presented 3 realistic solutions. Helen listened carefully before closing her notebook. "That's why I always ask for you, Andrew," she said. I laughed. "You know there are plenty of people here more important than I am." She smiled. I didn't say more important. Gathering her papers, she stood up and added, "I said you're the one I trust." At the time, I appreciated the compliment. I had no idea those words would eventually change my life. Inside the company, relationships like that had been built over years. I knew project managers by name. I remembered whose daughter had just started college, which superintendent had recently become a grandfather, and which estimator always skipped lunch because he was buried in paperwork. None of those things appeared on performance evaluations, but they mattered. People worked harder for leaders who noticed them. I believed that then, and I still do now. Because of those relationships, employees often came to my office before approaching senior management. Sometimes they needed help solving a problem. Sometimes they simply wanted another opinion before making a difficult decision. I never viewed that as influence. I viewed it as responsibility. If someone trusted me enough to ask for advice, I owed them an honest answer. Richard noticed those things too. One afternoon, after we wrapped up another successful project, he stopped beside my desk. "You know why clients keep asking for you?" he asked. I shrugged. "I answer my phone." He laughed. "No. Resting one hand on the back of a chair, he continued, "They know you'll tell them the truth, even when it's inconvenient." Then he walked away before I could respond. For someone like Richard, that was practically a speech. Moments like that made me believe I was exactly where I belonged. I wasn't chasing promotions or counting titles. I simply wanted to keep helping the company succeed. Maybe that was my biggest mistake, not because loyalty is wrong, but because I eventually confused loyalty with security. Back then, I believed that if you worked hard enough, stayed honest enough, and helped enough people, the company would naturally take care of you. Life doesn't always work that way. Everything began changing the morning Richard called an all-hands leadership meeting. Nobody knew why. Rumors spread through the office before 9 o'clock. Some people thought we were acquiring another company. Others expected a major expansion announcement. Instead, Richard stood at the front of the conference room and smiled in a way I hadn't seen before. It wasn't excitement. It was relief. "I've decided it's time," he said. The room fell completely silent. "After 40 years, I'll be retiring at the end of the quarter." For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then came the applause. Some people looked shocked. Others looked emotional. I looked at Richard. He seemed genuinely happy. For the first time in years, he wasn't carrying the weight of the entire company on his shoulders. He deserved that. Over the following weeks, conversations shifted from retirement parties to succession planning. I heard my name more often than I was comfortable with. People assumed I would take over. I never did. Not because I lacked confidence, but because I had spent enough years in business to know that assumptions usually disappointed someone. When Richard finally announced his decision, every executive gathered in the boardroom. He thanked everyone for helping build the company, then introduced its future, Ryan Brooks. Ryan stood, shook Richard's hand, and accepted congratulations around the room. He was 37, sharply dressed, highly educated, and had helped secure several major development contracts during his years with the company. On paper, he was an excellent choice. Richard explained his reasoning carefully. The next chapter requires a different kind of vision. I remember looking around the room. Some people nodded. Others glanced toward me before quickly looking away. Ryan noticed those glances too. When the meeting ended, I walked over and extended my hand. "Congratulations." He smiled. "Thank you, Andrew. You've got a big job ahead of you." "I know. If there's anything I can do to help make the transition easier, just ask." His expression softened. "I appreciate that." And I meant every word. I wasn't interested in proving Richard wrong. If Ryan succeeded, the company succeeded. That was enough for me. At least, that's what I believed. I had no idea that Ryan had spent the entire meeting noticing something I never did. Even after he became CEO, people were still looking at me before they looked at him. Over the next several weeks, I did exactly what I had promised. Whenever Ryan asked a question, I answered it. I introduced him to clients whose trust had taken years to earn. I explained why certain subcontractors were worth paying a little more for, and why others always looked cheaper until the change orders started piling up. More than once, I stayed late to help him prepare for board meetings. One evening, long after everyone else had gone home, we were still in the office. Blueprints covered the conference table while Ryan rubbed his eyes and stared at the presentation on the screen. "I don't know how Richard kept all of this straight," he admitted. "You don't have to," I told him. "You just have to know who does." He looked up and asked what I meant. "You don't build a company by having every answer," I explained. "You build it by trusting the people who already know them." Ryan nodded slowly, and at the time, I thought the conversation had gone well. Looking back, I think that may have been one of the moments Ryan stopped seeing me as a mentor and started seeing me as a problem. It wasn't anything I said. It was what happened afterward. The next morning, we met with department heads. Ryan led the meeting, but whenever someone asked an operational question, their eyes drifted toward me without even realizing it. One manager asked how we had handled a similar issue on the Westbrook project, and Ryan answered before I could. Later, a superintendent asked whether we should adjust the construction schedule. Again, people instinctively looked in my direction. I intentionally stayed quiet and allowed Ryan to make the decision himself. Nothing dramatic happened. Nobody challenged his authority, and no one openly questioned his leadership. But I noticed the pattern, and so did Ryan. Respect isn't something a title can command. It reveals itself through habits people don't even realize they have. At first, I assumed Ryan simply needed time. Every new leader goes through an adjustment period. I remembered my own first management role years earlier and knew that confidence doesn't arrive on the first day, it grows. So I continued helping wherever I could. About a month later, the first sign arrived. Every Monday morning, the executive team held a strategic planning meeting, yet my calendar remained empty. Assuming it was an oversight, I headed toward the boardroom anyway. Ryan met me outside with an apologetic smile. He explained that they were keeping the meeting smaller now to make decisions faster. If they needed operational input, he said, they would bring me in. There wasn't much else to say. His explanation sounded reasonable enough. In fact, later that afternoon, when two managers asked why I hadn't attended, I repeated Ryan's reasoning and defended the decision myself. Looking back, I realize I was defending a process that was quietly pushing me aside. That became a pattern. One missed meeting became 3. Then 5. Before long, I was learning about executive decisions from department managers instead of participating in them directly. Whenever someone questioned the change, Ryan always had a practical explanation. He spoke about streamlining communication, reducing unnecessary meetings, and empowering department leaders. Individually, each reason sounded logical. Together, they gradually erased my seat at the table. Around the same time, Olivia seemed to be everywhere. She had joined Bennett Development only a few months before Richard retired. Officially, she was our new business development manager. She was intelligent, polished, and exceptionally skilled at reading people. More importantly, she understood something many executives never learn. Influence doesn't always come from authority. Sometimes it comes from standing next to the person who has it. Ryan began asking for Olivia's opinion during nearly every leadership discussion. Soon, he started bringing her into meetings that had nothing to do with business development. Before long, she was sitting beside him during strategy sessions. Not long after that, department heads began receiving revised reporting structures. New layers of approval appeared where none had existed before. Experienced managers suddenly needed executive authorization for decisions they had handled independently for years. Nobody openly complained, but the atmosphere shifted. People became cautious. Instead of solving problems, they started asking permission. One afternoon, Marcus Reed stopped by my office. Marcus had been with Bennett Development almost as long as I had. After closing the door behind him, he asked whether I had noticed what was happening. I smiled faintly and admitted I had noticed a few things. He pointed out that I had been cut out of almost every major discussion. I replied that I was still busy, but Marcus wasn't interested in polite answers. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, I shrugged and told him that Ryan deserved the opportunity to lead in his own way. Marcus studied me carefully before saying, "I hope you're right." So did I. Unfortunately, hope isn't evidence. A few weeks later, one of the largest mixed-use developments our company had ever undertaken reached a major milestone. I had spent months coordinating consultants, negotiating schedules, and resolving permitting issues before construction even began. The board meeting celebrating that achievement took place on a Friday morning. Ryan opened the presentation and, as the slides advanced, described the project's success as an example of the company's new leadership approach. I waited for him to mention the team, the department heads, the engineers, someone. Instead, the presentation ended with applause. My name never came up. The only person who seemed uncomfortable was Marcus. He caught my eye from across the room, and I simply gave him a small nod. After the meeting, he caught up with me in the hallway and asked if I was really going to stay silent. When I asked what he expected me to say, he reminded me that I had built most of that project. "It doesn't matter who gets credit," I replied. He stopped walking. It should. Maybe he was right. But at the time, I genuinely believed success belonged to the company, not the individual. Recognition came and went. Results remained. At least, that was what I kept telling myself. Later, I learned something important. When good people refuse to tell the truth because they want to avoid conflict, someone else usually steps in and tells a much more convenient version of events. That's exactly what Ryan was beginning to do. Not all at once. One meeting at a time. One project at a time. One decision at a time. Eventually, people who had never worked closely with me started believing the company had become successful because Ryan had transformed it, not because hundreds of people had spent years building it together. Then another change arrived, and this one affected someone I had worked with for nearly a decade, Helen Carter. Ryan informed me that he would be taking over the relationship personally. He explained that it was important for clients to build direct relationships with the CEO. I agreed and told him I would help however he needed. He smiled and said he knew I would. At first, the transition seemed to go smoothly. Then one afternoon, Helen called me. She wasn't calling to complain. She simply had a technical question Ryan couldn't answer. After I gave her the information she needed, she paused before ending the call. "You're not in these meetings anymore, are you?" she asked. "No," I replied. I wondered. That was all she said. She never criticized Ryan. She never questioned Richard's decision. She simply noticed the difference. I wish I had realized how much that difference would eventually matter. Instead, I convinced myself everything would settle down. I worked harder, stayed later, and solved even more problems. I believed that competence always revealed itself in the end. I was wrong. Because while I was trying to prove my value through work, Ryan and Olivia had already started rewriting the story of who created that value in the first place. And the next project would give them exactly the opportunity they had been waiting for. The next project wasn't just another development. It was the largest commercial redevelopment Bennett Development had undertaken in years. If we delivered it successfully, it would open the door to several major contracts already waiting in the pipeline. Everyone inside the company understood how important it was. So when Ryan asked me to oversee the operational planning, I felt relieved. For the first time in months, it seemed like he finally trusted my experience again. I threw myself into the project. Weeks turned into months as I reviewed budgets line by line, walked the site almost daily, and met with engineers, architects, and contractors until most evenings stretched well past sunset. The deeper I got into the planning process, the more one issue continued to bother me. The construction schedule Ryan wanted simply wasn't realistic. Several suppliers had already warned us about material delays. Soil reports suggested additional stabilization work would be necessary. The timeline looked impressive in presentations, but reality rarely cared about PowerPoint slides. I spent 2 full days preparing a detailed recommendation. Rather than simply identifying problems, I offered solutions. I outlined alternative sequencing options, adjusted milestones, and contingency plans. When I walked into Ryan's office, I genuinely believed we were about to solve a problem together. Instead, he skimmed through the report for less than 5 minutes before sliding it back across the desk. He thanked me for the work, paused briefly, and then informed me that they would be sticking with the original schedule. I looked at him and asked why. He explained that they had already promised those dates to investors. If they adjusted the timeline now, he believed it would signal a lack of confidence. I kept my voice calm. They'll lose a lot more confidence if we promise something we can't deliver. Ryan leaned back in his chair and simply replied, "I've made the decision." The meeting was over. I left carrying the same report I had brought in. Later that afternoon, I uploaded my recommendations into the project documentation system, exactly as company policy required. At the time, it felt routine. I certainly never imagined those files would eventually become some of the most important evidence in my life. Marcus caught me in the hallway shortly afterward and asked how the meeting had gone. When I told him Ryan intended to stay on schedule, he frowned. Even after seeing the report, he asked. I nodded. Marcus sighed and said he hoped Ryan was right. "So do I replied. Neither of us mentioned it again. At the time, it felt like nothing more than another disagreement between experienced managers. For a while, the project appeared to move exactly as Ryan had predicted. Progress reports looked strong. Board meetings remained optimistic. Investors were pleased. Ryan received praise for keeping such an ambitious development on schedule. Part of me even wondered if I had been too cautious. Maybe years of experience had made me overly conservative. Maybe Ryan truly represented the fresh perspective Richard had wanted for the company. Those thoughts lingered longer than I'd like to admit. Because when someone slowly chips away at your confidence, you eventually start helping them do it, not intentionally. You simply begin questioning your own judgment before anyone else has the chance. Around the same time, I noticed another change taking place inside Bennett Development. Managers who once challenged ideas openly had become unusually quiet. Meetings ended faster, not because problems had disappeared, but because fewer people were willing to disagree with Ryan. Olivia usually sat beside him with her notebook open, carefully observing every conversation. Whenever someone raised a concern, she would smoothly redirect the discussion. We need solutions, not hesitation. We can't let old habits slow innovation. We have to trust executive decisions. None of those statements sounded unreasonable. That was exactly what made them so effective. Little by little, disagreement became something people avoided. Experienced voices spoke less. Loyal voices spoke more. The company wasn't becoming more efficient. It was becoming more careful. One afternoon, while walking through the operations floor, I overheard two younger project managers debating whether they should bring a scheduling issue to Ryan. After a brief discussion, one of them shook his head. "Let's just leave it. We'll figure it out ourselves." That bothered me more than I admitted at the time. People shouldn't be afraid to bring bad news to leadership. Bad news that gets ignored never disappears. It simply becomes worse news later. Not long afterward, Helen called again. This time, she wasn't looking for technical information. She wanted an update on the redevelopment project. I answered honestly and told her we were making progress. She hesitated. "You don't sound convinced." I smiled even though she couldn't see it. "I'm just making sure we are prepared for every possibility." There was a brief silence before she responded. "That's one thing I've always appreciated about you." "What's that?" "You've never confused optimism with planning." The comment stayed with me long after the call ended. At first, I assumed she was simply being encouraging. Later, I realized she had already begun noticing differences between Ryan's leadership style and my own. Not dramatic differences. Small ones. The kind that only become obvious after years of working with the same people. Then the first delays arrived. Nothing catastrophic at first. A shipment missed its delivery window. A subcontractor requested additional time. Unexpected site conditions required corrective work. They were exactly the types of issues my report had anticipated. The project could still be saved, but only if leadership adjusted quickly. Instead, Ryan doubled down. During executive updates, he described every setback as temporary. Whenever department heads suggested revising the schedule, he rejected the idea outright. "We are too far in to change direction now." The room fell silent. I looked around the table and noticed several people avoiding eye contact. Marcus quietly closed his notebook. Nobody argued. Not because everyone agreed. Because everyone already knew what happened to people who challenged Ryan publicly. I left that meeting with a feeling I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't fear. Not yet. It felt more like standing on a beach and noticing the tide had suddenly disappeared. Everything still looked calm, but instinct told you something much larger was already moving toward shore. A few weeks later, the project's problems could no longer be hidden. Deadlines slipped. Costs increased. Investors started asking difficult questions. Before anyone had the opportunity to investigate what had actually happened, Ryan began holding private meetings with senior leadership. I wasn't invited. Again, when I asked my assistant if she knew what the meetings were about, she looked uncomfortable. "I thought you were already included," she said. I wasn't. She lowered her eyes toward her desk and quietly apologized. That was the moment something inside me finally shifted. For months, I had convinced myself that every exclusion had a reasonable explanation. Every missed meeting. Every reassigned responsibility. Every overlooked contribution. But this felt different. Decisions about a project I had managed for months were now being discussed behind closed doors without me. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. I told myself Richard would never allow anyone to rewrite the truth. I wanted to believe that. More than anything. Then an email appeared in my inbox. Subject: Project Review Meeting. Attendance required. The meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock the following morning. I remember staring at the screen for several seconds. I thought it was finally my opportunity to explain everything. I had no idea the decision had already been made before I ever walked into that room. I arrived at the meeting expecting a difficult conversation about the project. Instead, the moment I opened the conference room door, I noticed human resources sitting beside Ryan. A folder rested neatly in front of every person at the table. Richard Bennett sat quietly near the end of the room. No one smiled. No one looked surprised to see me. Ryan began speaking before I had even taken my seat. He summarized the project's delays, the budget overruns, and the growing concerns from investors. Every problem was presented as though it pointed to one conclusion. Operational leadership had failed. As he worked through the presentation, I realized that months of decisions had been condensed into a simple narrative, one that ignored every recommendation I had documented before the schedule was approved. When I tried to explain that I had advised against the aggressive timeline from the beginning, Ryan calmly replied that every executive had supported moving forward and that leadership required accountability rather than excuses. I turned toward Richard, expecting the man who had trusted me for a decade to ask a single question. He remained silent. That silence hurt more than any accusation ever could. It told me the outcome had already been accepted before the meeting had even begun. HR quietly slid a folder across the table. Inside was a resignation agreement. In that moment, I finally understood why no one had asked me to prepare a report. No one wanted an explanation. They wanted a signature. For a long moment, I looked around the room. Some executives avoided eye contact. Others stared at the documents in front of them. Nobody challenged the story Ryan had constructed. I realized that continuing to argue wouldn't restore trust that had already disappeared. So I signed the paperwork. I stood, thanked everyone for the opportunity to work beside them over the past 10 years, and walked out without raising my voice. The office looked exactly the same as it had that morning. The difference was that it no longer felt like home. I packed my family photos, notebooks, and a few personal belongings into a small cardboard box. People reacted in different ways as I walked through the building. Some quietly wished me well. Some pretended to be too busy to look up. Others watched from a distance, uncertain what to believe after hearing Ryan's version of events. Marcus intercepted me near the elevator. He looked like he wanted to say something important. Instead, after a long pause, he simply said, "I'm sorry." I nodded. "So am I." Neither of us mentioned the project. Neither of us mentioned Ryan. There was nothing left to say inside that building. Driving home, the passenger seat held nothing except the cardboard box. It was surprisingly light. 10 years of work had somehow been reduced to a few photographs, a coffee mug, several notebooks, and a collection of handwritten thank you cards from clients. That evening, I spread everything across my dining table. Each photograph reminded me of a completed project. Each handwritten note reminded me of relationships that had taken years to build. I picked up one of the client cards and caught myself smiling. I could still remember the project. The late nights. The impossible deadlines. The relief on everyone's faces when we finally handed over the keys. For years, those memories had made me feel proud. That night, they felt different. They felt like reminders of a life that no longer existed. For the first time since joining Bennett Development, I wondered whether I still belonged in the construction industry at all. If the company I'd devoted a decade to could discard me so completely, maybe I'd misunderstood my own value from the beginning. I wasn't thinking about money. I wasn't even thinking about finding another job. I was trying to answer a much more uncomfortable question. Who was I if I wasn't the person everyone called whenever something went wrong? That question stayed with me longer than I wanted to admit. The following morning, before I'd reached any answers, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed a familiar name. Helen Carter. I almost let it go to voicemail. Part of me wasn't ready to talk to anyone connected to my old career. Instead, I answered. Helen didn't begin with sympathy. She began with a question. I heard what happened. Are you working anywhere yet? No. Good. I frowned. Good. I know a company that's struggling. They don't need another executive with a polished resume. She paused. They need someone I trust. For a moment, I couldn't think of anything to say. After everything that had happened, I'd started believing the story Bennett Development had quietly written about me. Helen hadn't. She continued before I could respond. I've worked with a lot of companies over the years, Andrew. I don't stay because of logos. I stay because of people. And you're still the same person I trusted last month. Those words stopped me from making the biggest mistake of my life. Until that moment, I'd been measuring my value by whether Bennett Development still wanted me. Helen reminded me that my reputation had never belonged to the company in the first place. It had always belonged to me. By the time we ended the call, she'd arranged a meeting with the leadership team of a struggling competitor the following week. Less than 24 hours earlier, I'd walked out of Bennett Development convinced my career might be over. I didn't realize it then, but I had just taken the first step toward the future that would eventually make Richard Bennett call and ask for my help. When I walked into the offices of Harper Ridge Development the following week, nobody treated me like the man who had just failed. They treated me like someone they hoped could help. That difference mattered more than I expected. Harper Ridge wasn't a flashy company. The building was smaller. The budgets were tighter. The office furniture had clearly seen better days. But from the moment I arrived, I sensed something I hadn't felt during my final months at Bennett Development. People still wanted things to get better. They simply didn't know how. During my first month, I barely changed anything. I listened. I met with project managers one by one. I visited job sites. I sat with estimators. I spent time with coordinators. I asked superintendents what slowed them down. I asked administrative staff which processes frustrated them the most. Instead of arriving with a grand plan, I tried to understand why capable people had stopped believing they could succeed. Eventually, patterns began to emerge. The company wasn't suffering because people lacked talent. It was suffering because departments had stopped trusting each other. Problems traveled too slowly. Decisions traveled too late. By the time leadership learned something was wrong, the damage had usually become expensive. So that's where we started. Not with sweeping reforms. With conversations. Weekly leadership meetings stopped being presentations where everyone tried to sound impressive. Instead, they became discussions where people could admit something wasn't working without worrying about who would be blamed. Project managers were encouraged to raise concerns early. Department heads started sharing information instead of protecting it. Younger employees were invited to contribute ideas instead of waiting until they had enough seniority to speak. The changes looked small from the outside. Inside the company, they changed everything. Every week, the atmosphere became a little lighter. People smiled more. Conversations lasted longer. Problems surfaced earlier. Solutions arrived faster. For the first time in a long while, I found myself looking forward to Monday mornings instead of counting the hours until Friday. That realization caught me by surprise. I hadn't simply found another job. I had found a place where leadership felt the way I'd always believed it should. Around that time, Helen gave us an opportunity. It wasn't charity. She made that very clear. I've watched both companies closely, she told me. This project is going to the team I believe will execute it better. That meant more to me than she probably realized. She wasn't rewarding loyalty. She was rewarding trust. The project became our proving ground. It wasn't easy. Unexpected weather delayed several deliveries. One subcontractor experienced staffing shortages. A supplier informed us that key materials would arrive nearly a week late. A year earlier, I might have worried about how those setbacks would look. Instead, we focused on how to solve them. Everyone contributed. Nobody wasted time protecting their own department. When one schedule changed, every team adjusted together. We communicated openly with Helen throughout the process. We never promised what we couldn't deliver. When the project was completed, we finished on schedule. More importantly, Helen thanked the entire team, not because everything had gone perfectly, but because we'd been honest every step of the way. A month later, she trusted us with another project. Then another. Neither decision happened because I asked. They happened because we consistently delivered what we promised. Word spread quietly through the industry. Harper Ridge wasn't suddenly becoming the biggest developer in the region. It was becoming one of the most dependable. Ironically, that had once been Bennett Development's greatest reputation. Meanwhile, I occasionally heard updates from former colleagues. Never gossip. Just facts. One evening, Marcus called. I figured you should hear this from someone who was there. What happened? We lost another senior project manager. I stayed quiet. He wasn't fired, Marcus continued. He resigned. Where's he going? Marcus gave a soft laugh. You're probably going to recognize the company. I already had a feeling. Harper Ridge. Yeah, I didn't recruit him. I know. Nobody here contacted him. I know that too. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Marcus said something I never forgot. People aren't leaving because they hate Bennett. He paused. They're leaving because they want to work somewhere they're trusted again. After we ended the call, I sat quietly in my office. The most satisfying part wasn't hearing that someone had resigned. It was knowing they hadn't been persuaded. They had chosen. That distinction mattered. I had no interest in taking revenge by dismantling the company I'd spent 10 years helping build. But if experienced people voluntarily believed they could do their best work alongside us, that wasn't something Ryan, or anyone else, could control. Over the following year, more experienced employees made similar decisions. Not dozens. Just enough for people throughout the industry to notice a pattern. Every departure created another gap in experience. Ryan filled those positions quickly. But experience doesn't transfer overnight. Neither does credibility. At Harper Ridge, our own momentum continued building. Several younger managers I'd been mentoring began leading major projects themselves. Watching them succeed brought me a kind of satisfaction I hadn't expected. Years earlier, I would have measured success by promotions, titles, or bigger offices. Now I measured it differently. If someone on my team became more confident because I'd helped them grow, that felt like real leadership. It wasn't about becoming indispensable. It was about making other people stronger. Somewhere along the way, I realized how much my perspective had changed. At Bennett Development, I'd believed leadership meant carrying the company on your shoulders. At Harper Ridge, I learned leadership meant creating an environment where other people could carry it with you. That lesson stayed with me. While our company continued gaining momentum, Bennett Development seemed to be losing its footing. I noticed it gradually. Industry reports mentioned delayed developments. Trade publications started questioning whether several major projects would meet their revised schedules. Investor presentations became increasingly optimistic, even as the actual results grew more difficult to ignore. Then Marcus called again. This time, his voice sounded different. This one's serious. What happened? The board has started asking questions. I leaned back in my chair. About what? Everything. He explained that investors had become increasingly concerned about declining project performance, growing employee turnover, and a series of costly executive decisions that no longer made financial sense. The confidence Ryan had tried so hard to project was beginning to crack, and once people started asking questions, they didn't stop with project schedules. They started looking at leadership itself. I had spent years believing I would eventually need to defend my reputation. What I didn't realize was that the truth had already started doing that work for me. And this time, I didn't have to say a single word. A few weeks after Marcus and I spoke, the story spread beyond the boardroom. At first, it stayed inside Bennett Development. Then investors started asking harder questions. Soon after that, industry publications began reporting on the company's declining performance. None of the articles focused on a single disastrous decision. Instead, they described a pattern. Delayed projects. Rising employee turnover. Major clients quietly taking their business elsewhere. Repeated executive overrides of experienced operational advice. The company wasn't collapsing because of one mistake. It was suffering from years of them. Then another issue surfaced. Ryan's relationship with Olivia. Most people inside Bennett Development had suspected they were unusually close for quite some time. But once the relationship became public, people began looking back at decisions that had once seemed merely questionable. Years earlier, after Ryan rejected my recommendations, I had uploaded every report, risk assessment, and supporting document into the company's project management system because that was simply our policy. At the time, I hadn't been trying to protect myself. I was just doing my job. Those files had remained untouched for years. Now investigators found them on their own. Time stamps. Meeting records. Risk assessments. Every recommendation I had made before the project failed. Every warning about the aggressive schedule. Every alternative plan. The record showed exactly what had happened. Ryan had personally overruled those recommendations. For a long time, I'd imagined I would someday have to fight to clear my name. Instead, the truth quietly surfaced without me lifting a finger. That taught me something important. Real evidence doesn't need dramatic speeches. It simply needs time. One afternoon, my assistant knocked gently on my office door. Andrew. She smiled politely. Richard Bennett is here. For a moment, I simply looked out the window. 3 years earlier, I would have hurried downstairs without thinking. This time, I took a slow breath before standing. Not because I wanted to make him wait. Because I realized I no longer felt the urgency I once would have. When I entered the conference room, Richard stood to greet me. He looked older than I remembered. Not just older. Tired. The confident founder I'd worked beside for 10 years now carried something I'd never seen before. Regret. We shook hands. He held mine a little longer than usual. I owe you an apology. I didn't interrupt. I should have listened to you. His eyes drifted toward the conference room table before he continued. When I chose Ryan, I believed I was choosing the future. He let out a quiet breath. I confused charisma with leadership. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, he looked back at me. The board wants you to come back. He explained everything. Investor confidence had continued falling. Several major clients had left. Experienced employees were gone. The board believed the company needed stability. It needed credibility. And, in his words, it needed the one person they never should have allowed to leave. Years earlier, I had imagined this exact conversation countless times. Back then, I thought hearing those words would feel like victory. I imagined satisfaction. Maybe even vindication. Instead, I mostly felt grateful. Not because Bennett Development finally recognized my value. Because I had reached a point where I no longer needed them to. I looked around the room for a moment before answering. I appreciate you coming here. Richard nodded quietly. And I'll always be grateful for everything Bennett Development gave me. That much was true. The company had given me opportunities, friendships, experience, a decade of lessons I still carried with me every day. I paused. But I already work somewhere people trust my leadership before things fall apart. Richard closed his eyes for just a moment. Then he smiled. It wasn't the smile of a man who got what he wanted. It was the smile of someone who had finally accepted the truth. I was afraid you'd say that. I know. I don't blame you. For a second, he looked surprised. So, you forgive me? I nodded. I do. The answer surprised me just as much as it surprised him. Because it was completely honest. Holding on to resentment would have kept me tied to the worst chapter of my life. I'd spent too many years building something better to keep looking backward. Richard stood and extended his hand one last time. I'm proud of the leader you've become. I smiled. I think I became that leader because of everything that happened. After he left, I walked through the offices of Harper Ridge before heading home. A project coordinator stopped me to ask for advice on an upcoming client meeting. Someone from accounting waved as I passed. Two site supervisors were discussing tomorrow's inspection schedule in the hallway. One of our younger project managers excitedly showed me photos from a project his team had just completed. None of those people greeted me because of my title. They greeted me because we trusted each other. That was something no promotion could ever create. As I walked back toward my office, I found myself thinking about the small cardboard box I'd carried out of Bennett Development years earlier. At the time, I believed I was leaving behind everything that mattered. I couldn't have been more wrong. The company hadn't made me valuable. It had simply been the place where I discovered the kind of leader I wanted to become. Losing it forced me to find the place where those values actually belonged. People sometimes ask whether I ever regretted refusing Richard's offer. The answer has always been no. Because if I had gone back, I would have spent the rest of my career trying to repair the past. By staying where I was, I got to keep building the future. Looking back now, I realized the biggest lesson wasn't about revenge. It was about identity. For years, I believed I had been building Bennett Development. The truth was, I had been building myself. The company lost me. I never lost who I was. If there's one thing I hope people take away from my story, it's this. Loyalty is a strength, but it should never cost you your self-respect. Titles can be handed to someone else overnight. Trust has to be earned every single day, and once you've earned it honestly, no one can take it away by changing your job title. So if you've ever been overlooked, pushed aside, or made to question your own worth, don't let someone else's opinion become your identity. Sometimes the worst thing that ever happens to you becomes the reason you finally discover what you're truly capable of. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, I'd love to hear what you would have done in my position. And if you enjoy stories about integrity, resilience, and earning justice the right way, I hope you'll join me again for the next one.